Perfect. So it looks like we should be in now. And perfect. Amazing. Right on the nose. Love it. So on time. Well, thank you everyone for coming. We're so excited to be here today. I think I should know most of you. I'm Fatima Zaidi. I'm the founder and CEO of Quill. As most of you know, Quill is a full service podcast production agency. We specialize in working with Fortune 500 brands on their branded content, their branded podcast, audio, and video. And we're also the creators and builders behind Co-Host, an analytics software catered to brands that are podcasting. We built Co-Host a few years ago because we weren't really getting access to the data that we needed in terms of our clients being able to understand ROI of their podcast and whether or not their show was successful and reaching the right folks. And so we knew that if we were going to continue working within this space and being able to justify the creation of new production budgets, that we really needed to build something for our clients that was a little bit more comprehensive in terms of analytics and growth offerings. So that's a little bit about our team. I am so excited because today I'll be sitting down with Steve Pratt, who's a brand marketer and the author of Earn It. So in a minute, I'm going to hand it over to Steve to do his own intro. Steve is actually a longtime friend of mine. When I first joined this industry, he was one of my first calls, and the reason I gave him a call was because I feel like he's truly the godfather in terms of branded podcasting. He's worked on some of the best shows, some of my favorite branded podcasts. He's been incredibly generous with his time and mentorship, and we've just become really good friends over the years. And so I'm really excited to sit down and talk shop industry best practices with him, really to focus on the importance of creating a podcast that's from you and not about you. In other words, we really want to break down how to make branded content in a way that grabs your audience's attention and makes you stand out above the noise. Specifically for today's session, we're going to be covering how to frame your podcast as a gift to your audience so that it can only come from you. How are you going to be the first, the best, or different? We're going to provide you with actionable tips for creating a show that really captures your listeners' attention. And also my favorite topic, which is how to measure your podcast performance beyond just the download count. Like, we get it. We know downloads are important, but there's so many other metrics that you should be paying attention to that will really help you level up editorially. I strongly believe that now is the time branded podcasts really need to shift from promotion to value creation. And so today we really hope that you can walk away with how to create a show that really earns attention, really builds trust, and drives real impact. So without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Steve to do an intro of himself and his book that just launched recently. And I have a copy. My whole team has a copy. Our clients are going to get a copy. So please make sure that you check it out. And Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Fatima. It's so nice to be here. And that was a very, very nice intro. I feel like that this event right now is actually a great example of all the things we're going to talk about today. Is that we are coming into, as people in different areas of the industry, to come together to talk about best practices and ideas that are going to benefit hopefully all of you listening and attending. That it is not going to be a sales pitch for my book or for Quill or for Co-Host. That it is going to be us talking about ideas that are that we have learned that are hopefully going to be of benefit to you. I think in some ways, some of the stuff that I like talking about is like really wonderful and exciting and values based around being generous and empathetic and building trust and connections. And some of it is kind of unpopular because there's no shortcuts and hacks, that you actually have to do the work and earn people's time and attention by doing things that are actually valuable. So I don't know, maybe we'll get a mix of both of those today, and we'll see how much everybody loves it, or kind of like is like, oh, that sounds awesome. You have to do the work.
I mean, I think that should be everyone's first lesson, that podcasting is a marathon, not a sprint, based on everything that Steve just said. And it really takes time to build a really great community that's loyal to your content. So on that note, Steve, this is something that I was really thinking about when I was reading your book. And this is a sort of a topic that's come up repeatedly, which is, why do you think so many branded podcasts really fail to capture attention? At Quill, we are notoriously famous. In our intro calls, we always ask our clients, would you listen to this podcast if you didn't work at your company? And that is the filter that we lead with. So I'm curious, like, why is that such a hard concept for brands to wrap their head around? Like, would you listen to this show?
I think part of it is because it's a marketing job. Like we're making a show for a desired marketing outcome. And by, almost by definition, the thing that we want is something for our own company. We want sales, we want brand awareness, we want brand
Mhm.
positioning, we want net promoter score, whatever the desired outcome that we're looking for is. I think we default to trying to like get there as fast as we can. And the obvious way to do that is let's tell everybody about how great we are, or let's show
Right.
everybody how smart we are and talk about our own business or products or services. And I think, the hard truth is, to your question, would I listen to this if I wasn't working here? When you think about it as an audience member, no one is sitting there waiting with bated breath for a brand to put out a new piece of branded content,
Mhm.
especially if it feels like that thing might be an infomercial or it may be, entirely selfish, in terms of like what they want from us. That I don't
Mhm.
think anybody is sitting around being like, I can't wait for a transactional piece of content to show up on my doorstep. Um, and so when you think about how many people are doing that, the opportunity to do something different and to be really generous and think about what are the needs of the audience that I am trying, to connect with, and what are all the strengths and areas of expertise and experience that we have. How can we design a gift that could only come from us, that is going to be really truly honestly valued by the people we're trying to reach? Suddenly you're like playing a very different game. Like I think everybody else is,
Totally.
trying to force their way into people's time and attention, and to be welcomed into people's time and attention because you're creating value it really is a different game.
We like something that I always think about is podcast listening is so transactional. We are asking for their most valuable resource, which is time and attention. And in exchange, they're asking for something in return, whether it's to be educated or entertained or inspired in some way. And understanding those key drivers of appeal really can help you level up editorially. An example that comes to mind is we had a bank that reached out to us last year, and they was a national bank, and they wanted us to create another podcast, interview style podcast with two people talking about cybersecurity products. And I was like, okay, Susan, I'm going to stop you right there. Nobody is going to listen to this show. 30 minutes of someone talking about cybersecurity products, like I cannot think of anything more mind numbing than that. And so we came to the table with the concept of creating a reply all type show where we actually go undercover and chat with people who have been impacted by cybersecurity crimes. And we can still include an interview component where we have subject matter experts who can educate the public about how to keep themselves safe from identity theft or cyber crimes. But at the crux of it, we wanted a narrative show where people could see all of the different cybersecurity hacks that were happening out there to everyday people like you and me. This show ended up being the number one technology show on Apple for so long because it was actually a podcast that people would want to listen to. I loved Reply All. It was one of my favorite shows. And I would love to hear an example of during your Pacific content days, like what was one of your favorite shows that you felt was so unique to the client and it couldn't be replicated?
It's so funny that you say this about cybersecurity, because I have a really good cybersecurity example also.
Oh,
We worked with this company called McAfee, and they're a
oh yeah.
software company that, puts out software to help consumers protect themselves from cybersecurity threats. And they wanted to enhance their, brand awareness and brand positioning as people who had expertise in that area. And the super obvious thing would be to have like some really boring cybersecurity expert be interviewed episode after episode about like, here's a
Right.
different cybersecurity threat. What should we know about it? And should we be worried? And how can we protect ourselves? And I just say that, and you kind of just start getting sleepy, being like, that sounds like a horrible use of my time. And instead, they were like, how can we take the exact same information that, an interview would provide and package it in a different way that is more entertaining? And so what they did was take, kind of a combination of other formats that are out there. They took some elements from Mythbusters, the TV show that kind of looks at urban legends and
Right.
myths and then tests them to see whether they're real. and some elements of like Mr. Robot, which is a great TV show about hacker culture, and made a show called Hackable. And basically every episode would take some premise of like, you know, this thing is something we hear about in pop culture about a cybersecurity threat. Should we be worried? So, for example, should we be worried about using public Wi-Fi in a coffee shop? And instead of just telling you the information, they put the host on public Wi-Fi in a public coffee shop and had a real hacker come in and hack the host and, and show you
Mhm.
what they can do in real time. And so you're kind of following this thing where you're getting all the information, but you're also on this journey of figuring out, is the host going to get hacked and how's this all going to play out? A bit of a spoiler, the host usually gets hacked and it's way worse than you thought. But that show also did really, really, really well because it was a show benefiting the audience and presenting the information in an entertaining way rather than just downloading a long form expert downloading facts.
So Hackable is actually, it was one of like the first branded podcasts that I really got into. It was one of my favorite shows. And I think that the thing that your team did so well back in the day with this show is that it didn't sound like an infomercial. Like you like it was one of the best examples of a podcast that provided value content and in such a subtle way promoted McAfee as a thought leader and subject matter expert without it being in your face, which is like how it should be in podcasting. And I think like for brands that are listening, we're not saying that you cannot promote your products and services. We're saying that there's a time and a place to do so. Utilize those pre-roll, post-roll, mid-roll ad slots if you wanted to promote some sort of an internal initiative that was happening at your organization. But the content should be true to really educating and inspiring your consumers. And the lens you should always be wearing is, would I listen to this on my morning commute or when I'm at the gym or walking my dog? And if the answer is no, then you've sort of failed to fall into the category of which we call the first, the best, or different.
Yeah, it's really interesting, when you actually think like a listener and you think about all the different things in the world that are trying to get your attention every single day, we're all getting pickier and pickier and pickier around what we're actually willing to give our time and attention to. Something has to be first or best or different, or just incredibly valuable
Right.
in a different way to actually do that. And so, this is, when I was talking about the unpopular stuff off the top, the unpopular piece is like, you have to be really good. Like you actually have to set a very high quality bar or people aren't going to listen. And in some ways, if you start with that idea of like time and attention as your first priority, you realize that nothing else matters if you don't have time and attention. Like if no one actually clicks play because it looks like an infomercial and feels like an infomercial and sounds like an infomercial, you get no listeners, you get no downloads, you get no ads served, you get no brand awareness or positioning, you have no audience built up. Like there's none of it there without attention. So thinking first about that question, would you listen to this if you didn't work here? Another version of that you could ask yourself is, at the end of spending time with our show, would people say that was time well spent? If they had a chance
Yeah.
to go back in a time machine and make the same choice,
Yeah.
would they make the same choice because it was that good? That's the bar. It's a really high bar, but it's hard to do, but it's so worth it. Like the spoils of making something that people really value, enormous.
And even if you just think about like day-to-day relationships with people, the thing that establishes trust is the generosity of spirit to give, not just take, and not have it be a transactional relationship. And podcasting is no different. The more you give, the more brand trust that follows. And I would say 9 out of 10 times a brand is entering this space for brand trust, recognition, credibility, thought leadership. And so the best way to do that is to really put your listeners first.
And I think there's a piece too about, what you're talking about, which is about patience. Also unpopular. Everybody wants short-term results. Everybody has got pressure for short-term ROI and revenue and sales. I totally get it. And it's real. And there's also this, other inconvenient truth, which is, we are talking about building trust and relationships. And just like every other human relationship, you kind of have to prove yourself over time. You don't just get trust by default. You actually have to prove yourself and be consistent by being great and showing your values and showing who you are. Again, that's where the real value is. And I think that podcasting is such an amazing way to do that, because if you actually have a recurring publishing schedule and you're making something that's really valuable, people get to spend a lot of time with you and know who you are. It's a really great way to build trust that builds relationships that then turns into customers down the road.
Yeah, I mean, there's no such thing in this industry as instant gratification. And that's often an education for us with our clients. Just really, taking a community, building a community around your show takes time. It's like building your company or your personal brand. It's not going to be an overnight success. And I think a lot of clients will approach us and have the Joe Rogan expectations. And I'm always just like, man, this guy was podcasting like before I was born. He like was doing it at a time when nobody even knew what a podcast was, frequently pushing out content. And I'm not the Joe Rogan audience. Like, I'm not the one who would tune into that type of content, but I will say the one thing that he does really well is consistency and frequency. And he's that has snowballed into momentum over the last decade, but he was doing it for a really long time. So it does require a lot of patience.
Yeah, you nailed it. I don't think people appreciate how long he's been doing it and how consistently he's been doing it and how much trust he has built up over and over and over again, just showing up.
Totally. Totally. And, there's this whole thought leadership paradox where positioning your brand as an expert often means talking less about yourself and amplifying others. We've tried really hard to do that here at Quill. And when I was reading your book, I remember this one chapter that really stood out to me because you said that brands should often do the opposite of what they think creatively. And so I would love for you to explain that because I think that chapter was so illuminating.
Yeah, I think just looking at the slide here, if you're doing what everybody else is doing, you're invisible. I think there's just a lot of pressure everywhere to be like, okay, well, what is Joe Rogan doing, or what's Alex Cooper, Mel Robbins doing, or like we want to just do what's already working and copy the things that are out there.
Mhm.
Being the second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th, 50th, 100th best thing, doing a copy of something else, there's not really much of a reason to choose you rather, compared to any of the other ones. It's hard to even notice your show if you're copying what everybody else is doing, or you're not doing something that's original or different. To me, every week, every month, even with AI now in making podcasts, there's more and more and more stuff out there to choose from and vying for people's ears. You have to be special and different. You actually have to do something that's noticeable, that's going to be like, oh, that's the one that does X, that is different than the other ones. Without it, you're just going to blend in a sea of sameness. So it's, I think I actually think for me, that's the stuff that kind of gets me up in the morning. It's just like, that's the exciting part, is figuring out how to make something that is special and different and that stands out and that people are going to talk about. I think in marketing, sometimes it's hard to do that because it's safer to do what everybody else is doing. Doing the opposite and kind of being brave is where all the spoils are.
This is such a common sort of benchmark that we walk into client meetings with, where they're watching what their competitors are doing. I was recently on a call with a client, and in terms of frequency, they wanted to push out a podcast episode twice weekly, focusing on quantity rather than quality, and not really having the time and bandwidth to look at the strategy, the data, the numbers, and focus on editorially leveling up. And when you ask, it's like, well, our biggest competitor is pushing out 2 episodes a week, and we just have no line of sight into, well, how many listeners do they have, what kind of resourcing do they have you listened to their episodes? And I do think that we really fall into this trap of like following the herd when it comes to marketing tactics. And I completely agree, like doing the opposite of what everybody else is doing, like that's what it means to take creative risks. And I'm curious, can you think of an example that you can share with our audience today when taking a creative risk really paid off for one of your clients or the brands that you work with? And I know that you're not running an agency anymore, and but I'm curious, like I know that you work with so many different clients and agencies, and even from in the past, if you can think of any examples that you're like, this really paid off for them.
Well, it's funny. The first client we ever had was Slack. We got very, very lucky with just an amazing first client. And I remember sitting in a boardroom in their office, trying to figure out what this show was going to be. And we were thinking like, man, we like back then it wasn't crowded, like branded podcasts weren't a thing, but we were, the barrier we were thinking was everybody else is listening to, Serial and things like that. That's our
Yeah.
competition. If there's
Yeah.
something's going to come from a brand, it has to be really interesting and good. And we did this thing called like an elevator pitch exercise with them, where we just asked them to talk about all these different pop culture references that, something about it resonated with Slack and the show they wanted to make. And they wanted to make a show that was about the kind of the future of work and where it was going. That was, they got the idea of making a show that was from Slack, but not about Slack. And
Is this Slack Variety Pack or Work
yes,
and
yeah,
Pack?
the
This
variety
is
pack
like
one.
another one of my favorite shows.
It was the weirdest show. Like it was such a weird show. And it was because of this elevator pitch thing. They picked 3 kind of cultural references, and they're like, okay, well, part of the show feels like really great personal storytelling like This American Life.
Mhm.
Part of it feels like showing that we get kind of the stupidity and weirdness of modern office culture, kind of like that famous Mike Judge movie Office Space.
Yeah.
And part of it is our own quirky, weird voice that has fun and playfulness, kind of like Monty Python's Flying Circus. And we made a show that actually led to the format of a kind of a show with a bunch of different elements that had some personal storytelling, like someone who's wants to give up their job and be a first passenger to Mars. We found stories about weird office culture, like that person in your office that everyone has who wears shorts to work every day, even when it's snowing. Uh, and then the weird Monty Python stuff was like, what would it sound like if there were audio emojis? Like we made that show, and that became a really distinctive, bizarre thing that took off. And I think the best thing about it was like when it started getting attention. Sorry, um, it got some press, and Fast Company actually had the headline. Slack's podcast, This American Life meets Office Space meets Monty Python's Flying Circus. You can actually use those sort of, kind of program development things for creating a differentiated show as a hook to get people to understand what the show is. Um, to this day, it was still one of the most fun shows I ever made because they were such a creatively brave brand to go for it.
And I remember the early days because I remember thinking that Slack went, for me, at least personally as a consumer, Slack went from being this like giant tech company that like, yeah, we use their product to, oh, they're actually doing really cool things with marketing, and they're early adopters. Like podcasting back then when Slack came out with Slack Variety Pack, that was one of the first examples of a really strong branded podcast. And it was after Slack Variety Pack came out that other tech companies like Microsoft and Salesforce and started paying attention and thinking, well, should we be early adopters and be pushing the boundaries of creativity? So that was a really smart way for them to also stand out creatively, because like I never thought of Slack as like a creative company. So I think that that's a really interesting example, and we also use podcasts as a medium to position our clients as thought leaders and subject matter experts. And sometimes the business objective can be really different. We work with a lot of the big pharma companies, and um, podcasting has not been, I would say, a common avenue or medium for pharma companies. And I think in general, there has been across the board, especially after COVID, a lot of mistrust towards what pharma companies can represent in terms of modern day medicine. And so I think podcasts have been a really great way for us to establish brand credibility and trust by creating more meaningful shows. We work with a client where we produced a podcast about the opioid crisis, and it's essentially it's like a helpline for anyone who's being impacted by the opioid crisis, for them to be able to tune into a resource that can help them navigate whatever scenario or situation they're in and find a community of resources. And I think we live in a time now where consumers are so desperate for authenticity, and they're really craving those authentic relationships. And for the first time, brands have a format and a medium where they can actually build a relationship with their customers beyond just This is what we do. This is who we are. These are our products and services. What's the mission? What are our values? What is the social activism work that we're doing? And what's happening behind the scenes?
That sounds like a super generous show, and I agree with you. Like, I think the authenticity part is huge. The Slack stuff was not made up. That was actually part of their real voice. And if you look at, even their release notes today in Slack when they do a software update, it is quirky and playful and fun in there. I think one of the really interesting thing maybe is an interesting point to make. Sometimes there's a misconception that like, oh, we're in a regulated industry like pharma or banking or insurance. This would not be a good place for us. I think it's actually the best for regulated industries because there's all these things that you can't talk about. You can't talk about your own products and services half the time. It actually forces you to kind of like zoom up like to 10,000 feet and think about like, what are the things that we can talk about that are going to be helpful for people that you're actually more likely to make a brave show that is going to earn attention and lean into generosity instead of selfishness.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the chat, and normally we do Q&As at the end, but I think this is the right format for us to do it as we go through the content. So Christina Bercy is in the chat. Hi, Christina. Good to see you. So the first comment she made that I want to call attention to is General Electric's podcast, which is such a great example of being creatively brave. So for those who haven't listened to the show, it's a podcast where they use GE technology to solve extraterrestrial messages. So very much like Slack Variety Pack, it's a very, very quirky show and different and unique. So I always say, are you the first? Are you the best? Are you different? And G's show definitely falls under being very quirky and different.
You know what the best about it is too? So it's a fictional like sci-fi piece. It was very, very early. There's almost no GE branding in it anywhere. Like just to this point, it's really, really lightly branded. And even today, whatever it is, like 10 years after it came out, we still know it was GE that did it.
100%. Everybody knows.
Yeah, right. Everybody does think, I've got to put logo wallpaper all over everything.
Yeah.
If you make something great, people know who did it. And you can use your favorite examples of, I always, for some reason, I don't know, this says more about my own cultural taste, but I always use HBO as an example. It's like, we know the network that makes Curb Your Enthusiasm. We know who made The Sopranos or who's making Last of Us season 2, Game of Thrones. We don't need things saying like, it's HBO, we did it. It's us. Like we know because it was great and we valued it. We know who gives us great gifts. And it's the same with brands. It's like, you don't have to tell everybody, they know. And the research proves it. The research proves like you can have a very, very light brand touch. People appreciate it more because it's surprising how light the brand touch is. Like I remember we used to tell some of our clients, and it was like a big, are you sure you're going to be okay with doing this? Don't have the name of your company in the show title. Don't talk about it. The only thing that we had as language was, there'd be like a cold open, like a first minute or two that was a story or a problem being posed or something that would get you interested in what the episode's about. And there'd be this little thing where the host would introduce the show and say what it was. And it would be something like, you're listening to Trailblazers, an original podcast from Dell Technologies or something like that. And that was it. And it was like that line. It was here's a show, an original podcast from Dell Technologies. And it's like, people remembered that. They knew who it was. We had research from Signal Hill Insights that was like, they know from a single exposure who did it.
Right.
They remember it and they like them more because it's not a heavily plastered infomercial. So I don't know. I think there's a real lesson to be learned in like less is more on this side too.
I actually have a sweatshirt that I wear all the time that says less is more, the whole collaborative consumption philosophy. And I agree, the most successful branded podcasts subtly position the brand as a trusted guide, not the hero. And so Christina's question here is, how do we talk brands into being more creative versus playing it safe? So obviously I know easier said than done. And Steve and I have a lot of experience with having to work through this process of convincing them to take creative risks. Steve wrote a whole book about it. So I will let you share a couple of actionable tips that Barcy and a couple other folks here can walk away with.
Well, I think, there's two pieces for me that I would always Well, there's actually, there's three. I'll say three. One is to think about your own consumption habits and to encourage, if you're working in a strategy group of thinking about what you're going to make, and whether it's a podcast or a video or a newsletter or whatever it is, get people to talk about what they like, what their favorite things are and why they like them,
Mhm.
and get some of the criteria for things that really earn a lot of attention and loyalty and word of mouth, and have those criteria up on a whiteboard, because that's your criteria for that's the bar that you have to do with your marketing piece.
Right.
I also like to use examples of best in class brands, like here's what's working right now, as almost like a case study to being like, this is what everybody else is doing, and if you're not willing to do that, maybe you shouldn't do it. And then the last piece is I would put up this graph, and it's a little awkward on a video camera, but it's just an XY graph. And on the bottom is the axis is a thing called creative bravery, and the vertical axis is commitment. And that was the thing I would start off every strategy session with, is like, this is the recipe for success. We have to be in the upper right quadrant up here with high creative bravery and high commitment. Creative bravery is, are you going to make a real show? Are you going to make something that's actually worth people's time and attention? We can kind of rate the creative bravery as we generate ideas during the day and figure out, like, hey, if it's your CEO hosting it and you're talking to your C-suite executives and your customers about how great you are, is that creatively brave? It's probably like sliding down towards zero. And then the commitment piece is like, are you actually going to use all your strengths to market this thing and commit to making sure that all the right people find out about it? If you make an awesome show and all the right people find out about it because you're marketing it properly, you end up with a fabulous result. Like, all the right people know you've made something that they value and spend a lot of time with and like you a lot for it. Um, Having that graph and those values of what people like in a show up on a whiteboard while you're deciding things, and kind of getting the group to rate ideas as they come up, where just the start of the thing is like, we're going to be talking about creative bravery all day today, because that's what earns time and attention.
Mhm.
To me, those things, it just makes it hard. It makes it harder for a group to be like, yeah, this is going to be amazing, downloading information about our own, like reading a white paper on a microphone or something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's important to understand that it's not like the brand's podcast needs to be a huge departure from the work that they're doing. I mean, if you have like a retailer apparel company, you don't need to go out and create a murder mystery podcast because, people are mostly true crime junkies. There's a way that you can find creativity within the vertical that you operate in. And I think a really good example that I can think of is Patagonia Stories. Um, their
They're so
whole
good.
they're so good. Their whole podcast motto is, "We're in business to save our home planet." Like, we all know that. We use their clothing, and Patagonia Stories is really focused on the present and future of our environment and how people can interact and preserve it. So all of the episodes range from accounts of climbing expeditions to investigative reports and interviews with environmental activists. And the podcast is not just for people who fantasize about getting away from it all and, the adventure life, or folks who can necessarily afford a $400 rain jacket, but it's about the real world and what it takes for everyone to maintain it. And so I just think that they've been so true to their mission and values and the environmental work that they're doing behind closed doors. And it's not a true crime junkie show or a serial or the shrink next door, which, like, also great content and, things that I tune into on a weekly basis, but a very different type of show that is educational, positions Patagonia as thought leaders, but they are not the front end hero. They're not front and center as the preach, 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 but rather they're showcasing other subject matter experts and providing something of value to their listeners. So that's another example that comes to mind in a show that I'm currently listening to that I feel like has done a really good job of the branding paradox and really understanding what that less branding actually means more impact.
I think, one of the other pieces you can do is like it is, not a new strategy, but I love it, is like making sure you've got like a variety of different ideas. So you may have some conservative ones, to make sure you push yourself and get some things that are just wild ideas, where you create that brainstorming environment where there's no bad ideas and you just generate lots and lots and lots of them. That if you're pitching ideas to somebody for approval, having at least 3 of them where you have one that's a kind of a crazy idea,
Right.
it almost like anchors things to be more likely to be brave, and it makes it, it shows you how boring the boring one is, that they're more likely, you can get something more interesting in the middle ground if it's anchored by things on the other side a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's, I don't know if everyone has their own process in terms of the creative pitch, but if you're putting together concepts, I think that's like typically what the way that we do it as well, is like we always have one idea that's really out there, and one that's, maybe more in line with what their CFOs would appreciate. And then usually it's like a happy medium, and finding middle ground. So, okay, this is my favorite topic. Everybody who knows me knows that I love talking about data and data associated with podcasting. I think that we still have a really long way to go in terms of folks paying attention to the right metrics. And I've notoriously said downloads aren't everything. What matters most is engagement, retention, and relationship building. And Steve, so I would be curious, and I know that you've been dealing with this from the early days of Pacific Content. A lot of brands are so fixated on that download or listener count as the primary measure of success. What would you say are better ways to measure impact? And by the way, I'm not saying downloads don't matter. I'm just saying they're one of many metrics that you should be paying attention to.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, this is not going to be a surprise for for hopefully for any of you, but like time and attention are the things that matter most to me. When I was saying off the top, if you don't have any time and attention, like everything else is for naught, like you have nothing.
Mhm.
So whether it's a YouTube video or whether it is a completion rate, for your episodes in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can tell where people drop off listening in your episodes or drop off watching. And
Mhm.
to me, that's like a marker of editorial quality and whether you're marketing to the right people. Like when you see people leaving, it's saying, I don't value this anymore. It's actually not worth my time and attention. That's to me the most important metric, is if you can get the majority of the people who start your podcast and click play all the way through to the end, you win. Like that's if I'm a marketer and I think about, well, what are the things that are, particularly in podcasting, the superpowers of podcasting are, if I do it well, I get like 30 minutes with my brand in somebody's ears over and over and over and over again. Like what other medium can you get 30 minutes of undivided attention on an ongoing basis, like on a schedule? You can't do it. And seeing people like potentially click play and just drop off like a rock, it says, oh, we have an editorial problem, or this is not the right show that they're finding value about it. Digging into those and figuring out, how are we doing with our time and attention? Like that's almost like the creative bravery measurement to me, is, are you making a real show?
Mhm.
And then, for sure, like downloads and, are, you know, a signifier of, are people finding the show? To me, that's almost like a marketing piece, are we seeing people coming in over time where it's growing?
Mhm.
Um, but it is a thing where it's a patience game. Like you're starting from zero. Almost every
Mhm.
podcast just starts from zero, that you have to not expect overnight results doing those things. How many people are coming back every week? Like if you have people come in and then they spend 10 seconds with your show and it craters and they leave, they're never coming back. And you have to kind of start from zero marketing to find all brand new people. If you got people who are spending a half hour and loving it and telling other people about it, they're going to come back, and because they're telling other people about it, your numbers are going to go up a lot faster. So I don't know, anything around time or attention, or like a net promoter score. I love also, because it's the super
Mhm.
high bar of like, would you recommend it to other people? Um, those are the really hard metrics that I personally love. How about you? I'm so curious, because like I have to say, I know this is from us and not us about us, but I feel like you've done a really good job thinking about metrics in a different way at co-host, and figuring out who's listening and are they the right people listening, and being able to actually show that sort of stuff.
Yeah, we care really deeply about building a legitimate community around your show. And I mean, if someone drops off in the first 10 minutes, yes, it constitutes as a listener or download, but does it speak to the success of your content and editorial? Quality, no, it doesn't. And so to your point, there's a whole slew of metrics that we built into our product to report on that we feel does a much more accurate job of paying attention to engagement. So things like consumption rate, listening time, episode engagement, and for those who aren't familiar with consumption rates, it's essentially the amount of time that someone is listening to your show. And generally, by industry standards, anything above 65 to 70% is considered to be good. And anything above 75 to 80% is considered to be excellent. So you really should be striving to be at that 80th percentile to get a true measure of, are people staying on to the end? I mean, to Steve's point, 93% of people who start a podcast episode end up listening to the entire show, and being actively engaged in another activity increases engagement. What other form of content can you get someone's undivided attention for 30 minutes? There's nothing. A 30-minute video only has 12% completion rate. And so it's such a missed opportunity when you're not really focused on keeping people engaged to the end. In fact, we have a term for it. We call it measuring the cost per minute of human attention. The cost per minute of human attention is the ROI that you should be leading with, because I mean, it's a really great way for people to build brand relationships with their stakeholders. Now,
I love the cost per minute, by the way, is like
thanks.
if you're trying to convince your boss to make a podcast instead of videos or things like that, podcasts are so much more efficient, in general for producing content than things like video.
Yeah.
But when you think about 30 minutes for audio and getting 80-90% of those 30 minutes with every single listener, you can have less listeners to a podcast than you might have for a video, but it costs you much less per minute of attention that you're getting from people because
Right.
they're spending so much time with you. And if I think about like who's more likely to become a customer, someone who spends 30 seconds with you or somebody who spends 30 minutes with you, it feels to me like targeting fewer people and having much deeper engagement and trust buildup is a better thing for your marketing.
100%. You hit the nail on the head, Steve. And also paying attention to, along with engagement metrics, a lot of the psychographic and demographic informations on who's listening to your show, so you can do a better job of tailoring content for them. So taking a look at things like the age range or their interests and hobbies, what social platforms they're on, what industries they're a part of, their job titles, what companies they work at. And by the way, you can find all of this data on co-host, but it's important to us because then we can be smarter about editorial content. And 80% of our audience are really into fitness, and so should we be tailoring content to fitness lovers? 60% of our audience is on YouTube. Okay, so then should we be prioritizing content for YouTube, or marketing campaigns on YouTube? So really just not necessarily doing the rinse and repeat, which is, I think, a common theme of today's webinar. Don't just keep doing the same things over and over again. If you Google podcasting, there's a lot of information on the basic tactics, the rinse, the repeats, but you really want to think about being different. And the whole mantra of today's webinar that I hope everyone can walk away with is strategically approach your content in a way that provides as much value to who you're creating your show for. It's better to be something to someone rather than everything to everyone. And so on that note, the final takeaway from our end would be brave, give first, earn attention. And Steve, I know that we've gone the entire webinar and I can see the book in the background. So I don't know if you want to just hold it out and maybe 30 seconds chat about what it is, but I'll give you the floor.
You know what? I'm gonna lean into my own advice. I'm not gonna plug the book. Like I'm just gonna say, like, if you've enjoyed the ideas in here, they all come from there. But like, I feel like the generosity is like again, to me, the best marketing thing, and being able to come and share ideas like this is such a treat. And I think you find your fit. If people are like, oh, that was really interesting, I really like those ideas and like to find out more, people end up going to Quill or co-host or buying the book, whatever it is. But I'm leaning into
Yeah, I think that's great.
consistency over time. There you go.
I think that's great. Everyone can find you. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a pleasure sitting across from Steve and chatting about the things that we really care about within this industry. I know we're going to be doing regular webinar series on best practices, tips and tips, the actionable tips that we have for our community on a variety of different sort of pain points within the podcasting industry. So stay tuned for our next session. And thank you for joining, and have a great week, everybody. Happy
Thanks, everybody.
Tuesday.
Thanks, Fatima.